Good morning, folks, and welcome to SPOT303, which is a little discussion about security operations at scale. I'm Steve Schmidt. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for AWS, and with me is a guest who I've been trying to drag up on stage for quite a while, and he's successfully avoided us to this point, but we're happy to have him here now. This is George Stathakopoulos. George, you want to give a little background on yourself?
Hi, I'm George Stathakopoulos. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer of Amazon.com, and I'm actually fairly excited to be here. Steve and I have been talking about doing something like that for a long time, so it's kind of nice to see this happening. We both work in the same company, but at the same time, we have developed over the years a customer versus service provider relationship. And in this process, we learned quite a lot of things, even about ourselves, and about actually making all this thing work. So hopefully over the next hour or so, we'll have the opportunity to share that with you.
George, could you give folks a little bit of a viewpoint on the scale of Amazon? It's obviously one of the principal things we're going to talk about here is how to operate very large-scale businesses on AWS.
So if you really think about my team's responsibility, our primary mission is about protecting customer information. So all the information that our customers have entrusted to us, the PII, the payment data, and so on. Beyond that, we have to protect the Amazon.com enterprise, which is basically everything Amazon except AWS that Steve is actually responsible for. So just to give you an idea about Amazon, think of 6 big logical networks. The first network is our corporate network that services roughly about 183,000 employees. Their desktops, laptops, specialized devices, our collaboration suites, our file servers, and so on. We then have our production network that contains millions of hosts, and partially it runs into what we call our classic infrastructure, which is our own services, and then partially runs on AWS. And in there, we have tens of thousands of services that interact with our customers to buy and sell products every day. We then have our logistics and fulfillment center network. This serves about 109 giant warehouses, and we serve about 285 million active customers in 185 countries worldwide. We then have a content network that contains about 38 million pieces of digital content. Think of this as instant video, music, books that our customers download or stream. And then we have several subsidiaries that are in different levels of integration with Amazon. Most of them run in AWS today.
Cool. All right, so the immediate question that everybody hears is, why did you move to AWS? I think there's been a lot of public statement about that, but I'd love to hear it just from you directly.
So I'm going to use the word retail. I really apologize to my PR team, but I'm kind of used to refer to us as such. Our business is fairly cyclical. So we have peaks and valleys through the year where the demand for our services increases a lot. So if you think like, in the US, we have the holiday season. In China, we have the Singles Day, and so on. And during those times, the need for capacity and our need to scale up our business is quite acute. So to be able to scale really quick and then descale immediately after the event is over in a financially sound manner, it just made sense to do this one in AWS. It was kind of natural for us to get to that point. One of the interesting things about scaling, and happened a couple months ago in July, where we ran an event called Amazon Prime Day. And just to give you the scale change compared to the same time last year, during that day in July, we had 266% increase in orders compared to the same day in July last year. It was actually 18% higher than Black Friday of 2014. And it was in a dizzying number of 398 orders per second. So when you have to do events like that, when you have to scale like that, the only logical way is to do it through AWS.
And when you're moving into AWS, obviously with your scale has to go your security, right? I mean, you can't just say, oh, I'm not going to be doing that anymore.
Correct. You can't scale like that and introduce new hosts, introduce new services really quick, and then keep your eye off the ball in security. You have to scale proportionally. And again, if you increase 260x-fold, your logs have to be able to increase that much. Your capability to do analytics has to increase that much. And the only way to do this is to be able to get AWS capacity.
Okay, so for you, AWS not only makes you more agile as a company in terms of scale up and down, but it also sounds like it makes your security organization more agile as well. And I think that's a reflection of what a lot of our customers are hearing, where they're focusing a lot on how they can continue to stay safe while moving extremely rapidly. And these guys sort of encapsulated that pretty well as part of their move to AWS. One area that George and I tend to share a lot of opinions on is about how to form security teams, how to get them to function together, and how to be efficient at the process of scaling both up and down. Both for Amazon.com and for AWS, we have found that our growth rates are phenomenally large. I mean, you've heard some of the statistics from George this morning. The same thing, of course, is true for AWS. And we've both had to find ways to build security teams that are extremely agile. And for those of you who heard my talk earlier, you'll feel very familiar with this, but we decided independently, interestingly, that forming our security teams in the same way made sense. And if you look at us, for example, we've got an operations team that's responsible for doing the everyday work of security, the engineering team who builds tools for us, our application security team who does all the testing of our new services and validation that they're doing things right, and then our compliance organization, which has to prove to our customers, and interestingly, by the way, prove to the same customer who's sitting next to me that we're doing things consistent with the regulatory regimes that they're subject to. So, George, it's true that you guys rely on our PCI certification in order to process your customer transactions, right?
That is correct. Also, as you're talking about the security team, if you looked at an org chart for my team, will look about the same. The only difference for us is that our infrastructure team tends to be much smaller since we're depending on Steve's team to actually perform most of our tasks.
And as part of the process of building those teams, we both tend to focus a lot on security ownership. We have the same theories of operations largely in terms of making sure that people within our organizations are owners of security. And the processes that we use tend to be pretty similar. George, I know that when we'd spoken earlier, you had said that one of the things that you've done a lot of work on is helping teams learn how to certify and accredit themselves internally so that they can be consistent with your expectations from a security perspective.
One of the, when you look at a scale, when you look at tens of thousands of services out there that deliver, value to our customers, it's kind of hard to have one centralized security team to do all the work. So we do believe in ownership. We do believe that every developer in the company should think security as the primary mission. So what we did is we actually figured a way to distribute that load across all our developers and have the security team to be an advisor to many of them.
Was there any particular method that you used that you thought was especially effective in that, or things that you would share?
I think, it's funny. When you deal with people where you introduce the topic of security, you end up finding two different types of pushback. The one of them is people are busy with their daily tasks. They want to, they want to ship whatever widget they have to go ship, and the last thing they want to think is about security. So a lot of the things we did is we used a form of shame, but we also used a form of technology. By using automation built inside our processes, we're able to flush out the areas of trouble.
Excellent. So our operating principles are very similar to each other. We tend to spend a lot of opportunity on separation of duties. It's something that we focus a lot on internally. It's something that you guys focus on as well. Different personnel across service lines. We have the same concept of host classes in our organizations, where we confine people's access rights to those hosts that are necessary for them to do their job. We revoke privileges the same way in terms of ensuring people don't have access to material that they don't need anymore. And we focus a lot on the least privileged principle, which means removing access to root from those staff members who don't need it and not provisioning the rights to root on machines where it's not necessary to do so. When we were talking about this discussion earlier, we decided to focus a lot on the bits and pieces that make us more successful when we operate at scale. And the number one change that we see at scale operations is how you gain visibility. In a traditional environment, it was okay to go digging through things manually and to try and have a person read a console and understand what's going on in an infrastructure. When you operate at our scale, I mean, George gave you some numbers that are pretty substantial in terms of millions of hosts. You can't do that. It's just simply not possible. So we both have had to focus a lot on visibility through log analytics. And it's an area that I think is one where the cloud is uniquely suited. When you think about the way that you used to do log analytics on a large environment, just the simple aggregation of the log process itself was difficult. You had to find a place to store the logs. There was always a tension between the cost of storage of those logs and the duration that you could keep that material. And then, of course, the process of analytics is one that's challenging in many circumstances. However, we found that a lot of customers have moved to services-based analytics. When you look at partners like Splunk, who offer you the ability to run Splunk on AWS natively, which is great because then you remove a lot of the excuses that people have had for not keeping good records. And we all believe pretty strongly that if you don't keep good records, you're never going to be able to understand exactly what's going on in your environment, and you're not going to be able to make sense of it over time. Now, shrinking the protection boundaries. This is an area that I know you've been focusing a lot on recently. And do you have anything you can share with us on that?
Yeah, and also we'll talk a little bit later about this, but one of the things that we found out, especially if you look at the threat environment and how it changes lately, if you have one giant monolithic organization that everything is completely interconnected, the possibility of things go wrong really quick, really fast, with very little recourse to repair the situation could be really bad. So we had our general thought is if you could actually break the business to as small parts as possible and put security controls in those little small parts of the business, then you can actually increase your security and you can also reduce the blast radius. Well, what if you shrink the borders in such a way that they completely become non-existent? What if you completely disappear, completely make the concept of a border disappear? And I think this is the area we're actually exploring right now in Amazon.com.
So when you speak of a border, do you mean just the border of a large network? You talked about those 6 networks that you've got there. The border for you is no longer that perimeter where it connects to the internet, right? Correct. It's now down on much smaller components?
Correct. The border is gone, basically, effectively. I mean, not really. The border is still existing in a lot of our production fleets and the whole thing, but where we're trying to move is where the border completely disappears and any entry and exit to the enterprise is directly through the internet and controlled through some sort of a shame.
Okay. Ubiquitous encryption is one that customers ask a lot about. It's an area that is ripe for opportunity and innovation. It's an area that you see our services focus more and more on. It's an area that our customers continue to ask more about, and it's one that your team has been driving a lot of innovation at inside our organization. Do you share the idea that pushing encryption down to the smallest possible piece is appropriate here? It's something that people should decide is a paradigm they wish to pick up?
Yep. Without overselling, by the way, the concept of encryption, right? Because there's other things you have to put into account too. I think think about like a customer data. If we're able to encrypt them in a phenomenal scale and we have the ability to perform the same transactions at the same scale we have today, then automatically you made part of our infrastructure invulnerable to an attacker, because if somebody takes it out, it's useless to them. So yes, we're a strong believer and you should move the encryption as low as you can.
All right, let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about the actual process of moving into AWS. And this, I'm sure, was something that's a non-trivial task for an organization your size. What are the challenges you ran into?
So it's not secret that we are one of the early adopters of AWS. And if you really go back in history and think how things started, originally our data centers between Amazon.com and AWS were fairly mixed. They were one and the same thing. But over time, one of the things that was quite clear as AWS was increasing their business and data centers were a keystone of that business, the level of innovation, either it is for cooling, either it is for management, either it is for security, completely outpaced our ability. So it's kind of hard to keep up with the Steves. So it was probably the first transition we ever did was move our physical host inside AWS data centers. As time went by, we started thinking how just to talk about this one a little bit more, it was literally a physical host running inside AWS data centers. The next step of the evolution is actually take advantage of AWS and using virtual hosts to run our business. And it was only through something like that that we have been able to pull the Prime Now event. As we move forward now, there's interesting ways you can actually think about moving an enterprise to AWS. You can think a place where there's no more physical controls, and everything about the enterprise is a series of soft controls. You could think about the enterprise being extremely granular, that you can think the analytics and the granular controls interacting each other to self-heal the enterprise. So for us, the flexibility is just tremendous.
So no move of any kind, whether it's your house moving or you moving into AWS, is without some kind of concern. You know, you're worried about the neighborhood you're moving into or something, losing your bags and your boxes. So what are your challenges in moving into AWS? I mean, number one has got to be people are worried about something. It's fear.
Yeah.
What is it?
So it's fear. If you really go back to what I said before, our number one priority is protecting the customer information. So as such, as an organization, we have a fairly conservative stance. In fact, some people will say it's extremely conservative. So any technology that we take our hands on, we have to analyze and make sure that we have a clear and deliberate path of transition. So I think the first fear that I had when I was moving to AWS, and irrational or rational, is the fear of losing control. As security engineers, it is against our mental model to give control to anything. If we could actually look at the electricity that comes into our host, we would actually inspect that too if we could. So you're getting into the space where all of a sudden you're taking a significant part of your infrastructure and you're entrusting it to somebody else. And you have to learn and make the mental model and the mental transition to that space. And here's some interesting things, right? Security personnel is finite, and security resources is finite. When you hire this great security engineers and you make them work on tasks such as tinkering with the hardware or tinkering with the firewalls and ACLs, you end up losing a layer of abstraction that I think is key when it comes to protecting a modern enterprise. For example, data analytics, data logs, detection, and so on. So I think that was possibly the biggest challenge we had.
So speaking of that, could you give us a little bit of your thoughts on what hardware devices? That was always a sort of major piece to data center protection that people have focused on in the past. Was it an area that you used to use, had to change the way you did business?
Well, it was kind of lucky enough that AWS was transitioning a lot on during the time I was there on the data center security, so we didn't really spend a lot of time thinking about that. But definitely there was an area where we would lose a set of visibility because we used to be able to get logs, and we used to be able to directly tinker with the hardware layer of our infrastructure. But I think today, where we sit today, and basically with also a set of AWS services that were offered, we're in a much better space. There's additional concerns, if you talk about challenges, that you could think about. When you move your infrastructure to AWS, you could make mistakes. If you don't read the documentation, if you don't spend time understanding about the correct security posture, you could get in a situation where you don't think about your ACLs correctly. You could accidentally spin a couple instances and open them up to the world. So all this stuff had to come into play, and all those challenges have to be addressed in a very deliberate manner before we were able to fully transition.
And I presume as you were addressing those challenges, you built tools around them?
Correct. It's interesting because there's a race between the tools that we build, and eventually you find native services that actually provide the same kind of value from AWS. And it's interesting because the costs of creating the tools and your ability to maintain the tools and your ability to plan the tools correctly in a distributed environment is actually quite expensive. So if you really think about the ability to absorb logs, you create something, a pipe to be able to select logs from your devices and put them to S3. Boom, there comes Kinesis. Oh, awesome, you solve a problem. Firehose now, and you can just see that the service is coming up and catching up, and that's kind of nice to see.
One of the fun things that these guys have as an advantage that a lot of customers don't is they tend to sit in buildings that are right next to us in Seattle, and they're on the same telephone system. So the process of suggesting new services tends to be really short. They also tend to poke us when we're in line at lunch and things.
As we said, we had a lot of learning and a lot of mutual shared experiences over the last few years.
So you talk a lot about logs, and more data, obviously, coming off of sensor systems is something that's appropriate, interesting, useful to you. It's an area where I spend a lot of time poking at people and hoping that they'll pay attention. How do you influence your internal teams, your internal staff in terms of log collection? Is it something you put a lot of emphasis on?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you can do security without having logs. I think both because of forensics, both because you can understand some interesting patterns, and both because you can actually prevent information, you have to be able to collect logs. And a lot of the times, you approach the teams, you explain to them the importance of that, but you really have to create the facilities and the tools for them once they expose the logs to be able to take them and push them upstream.
And so I presume that you do some form of then access control on the logs, right? So
Correct.
that the teams have access to their logs and not others. And do you use the same facilities then that AWS provides in terms of IAM users, et cetera, to give your security team access to the same log sets?
Yes. And that's the beautiful thing about that, right? We don't have to invent two unique separate infrastructures. We can use exactly the same structure to collect our logs in a secure manner inside the same AWS structure.
Enterprise challenges.
Yes.
Yes. This is an area that, of course, nothing is perfect, nothing is smooth. We have a lot of discussions with customers about the shared responsibility model, and it's an area, obviously, you and I have conversations about periodically there. The lessening of the load is something you've talked about already. How do you approach the shared responsibility model? What's your job in this circumstance?
So dirtying a little bit of dirty laundry here, right? So airing a little bit of dirty laundry here, right? When Steve and I started, taking our separate ways in AWS and the retail world, there's a clear delineation line about that shared responsibility. So AWS controls from the metal all the way to the hypervisor, and then everything above that is our responsibility. And it's really interesting because shared responsibility does not mean you're absolved of any responsibility when it comes to security. But what it also means is that you're not dropping the ball and not knowing where your responsibility begins. And I think this was probably one of the hardest things to grasp about what is shared responsibility for us. Are you going to share anything here?
Yes, it's an area that, of course, that we spend a lot of education time with customers. And if you have not had an opportunity to look at the security best practices white paper, there's a significant section on the shared responsibility model. It's useful not only for security professionals who need to know where they have to focus their attention, but it's also useful to your auditors and regulators because it enables them to understand the areas that they should be asking you questions about who's responsible for which portion of the infrastructure, and it allows them a place to go look to see how they should check your infrastructure to see if you're conducting things consistently with their expectations. So can you add a little bit of color around the idea of moving to ephemeral as part of the transition into AWS?
So internally, and you probably see this one a lot through our slides, we have this concept of ephemeral utopia. And ephemeral utopia is a place where the enterprise is completely dynamic. Nothing actually stays, every host moves, everything moves completely. So the ephemeral utopia, the dream of ephemeral utopia will be, and actually it's not a dream anymore, is the ability to, so if you can actually recycle a new host that is fully patched and fully ready to go faster than you have to scan it for vulnerabilities, find that you have to patch them, deploy the patches, and then reboot that host. So when we look at our enterprise, we're in full mode trying to get to this ephemeral utopia, and it's so nice to be able to see that.
That's an area that I think we should emphasize.
Yeah.
One of the best practices that we recommend to customers on a regular basis is depend on security by design, and as part of that security by design is templates. Templates, CloudFormation templates, AMIs that you've vetted as reasonable. It gives you a place where if you can, and obviously some services can't be designed this way, you build from a known good image, and when you have a host that's out of patching, for example, don't patch the host, replace the host with one that's newly built. The reason there is both one of functionality, because you have a much higher likelihood of success if you start with something that's known good, but it's also one of labor. George pointed out that it takes them more time and costs them more effort to bring things up to standards than it does to take the old host out back, shoot it, and get rid of it. So in all situations where you can, and obviously there are some things that you can't do that for, that's the model that we suggest people take advantage of. Now, when you moved into AWS, there are a lot of shared workload components that you needed to move into AWS. Can you give us a rundown of what they were, what you thought about them, how you chose them?
So I think up to this point, we talked mostly about our production network. But if you think about our corporate network, this is another case where AWS can actually help shrink the border or make it disappear. So today, Amazon runs all its collaboration suite onto the cloud. In fact, as we move forward, right, we expect the majority of our enterprise literally be on the cloud, and you get views from it, either you're a developer or you're an information worker or so on. Here's some really interesting examples that you can actually make it happen. We have a whole set of workers that have a very limited need for full access computers. So traditionally, think of this as the customer support representatives and so on. One of the beautiful things you can do is you can provide them a workspace and allow them to access the data in the data center. The data center will never, the data will never leave the data center, therefore increasing the security. Another thing that we just did, and I think it's a classic example of moving your infrastructure to the cloud, you can do some really exotic stuff. So we had a timekeeping application that was completely out of standards. It was using deprecated software. We did not want it inside of the enterprise, but for various reasons, we could not actually deprecate it. So one of the things we did is we created a bunch of workspaces, and we ran the application in there. And behind it, we put a series of soft firewalls, pretty much limiting what this application could do in the interaction with our network. So the more you move your infrastructure to the cloud, the more you can walk away from the traditional concept of a corporate network, the more you can realize some really interesting exotic scenarios.
I want to make sure people caught that particular piece because I think it's a design paradigm that really bears repeating. They had a set of old software that was out of date, software that couldn't be updated and patched. It's the classic legacy scenario, but they needed to keep using it. And rather having that software on their corporate network, contaminating the corporate network, or being a potential vulnerability, they were able to create a containment zone, a separate VPC, just for that particular set of software, and put then a very restrictive set of controls between that VPC and the corporate network as itself. Which from my perspective is just a freaking genius idea. It's a way that you can continue to keep those old workloads functioning, the ones that you'd love to get rid of, but you know you can't, and do so in a way that keeps them as far away logically from the rest of your infrastructure as you can. It also gives you a viewpoint, a single place that you can go and watch traffic to understand exactly what's going on with that legacy application, so that even if somebody is trying to exploit it, you have a fighting chance at identifying it. Where think about it, if you've got that sitting on a shared corporate infrastructure, you're in a situation where you better hope the bad guy doesn't stumble across it, try and exploit it, and do something unfortunate with it there.
And I think even the next point is kind of interesting, that talks about how we should be thinking about every application we create to totally exist in the cloud. Like many other companies, right now we're exploring an MDM solution. And it would have been much...
MDM is?
Mobile device management solution, which is basically checks your devices, makes your mobile device managed before it joins our network. So that is an interesting solution. A more interesting solution is to be able to have all your collab and other applications directly on the cloud, so the phone doesn't store anything locally, does everything up on the cloud, and gives us full control of the enterprise, and also absolves the device owner from any responsibility for that.
In the process of moving, I presume that, like many people, you think the idea of a big bang move is probably not a good idea.
Yeah.
And so how did you actually go through the move process?
Right, so one of the things that we like to do, to say a lot in Amazon, is never cross a one-way door, have two-way doors, something you can actually reverse after you tried it. So a lot of the time, the move to AWS for us was a series of experiments. We started small, sometimes we started big, and what we did is we learned with every iteration all sorts of different things that we had to take in account, which I think a lot of them fall into the shared responsibility bubble. Once we're able to iron something out, and once we're able to pretty much describe a scenario from the beginning to the end in simple terms, then we're able to move that particular function wholesale into AWS. And I think that has been a fairly successful thing, so we did not make a lot of mistakes. And in general, my general advice to you is keep reiterating until you hit a tipping point, which for us has already gone, and then move to AWS.
As part of the process of creating the tipping point, I found interesting some of the levers that you used internally. I know one of them was as people's hardware hosts were deprecated, you didn't give them an opportunity to get a new hardware host. You said you had to move to a virtualized environment to force the workload change.
Yeah. And maybe that's something interesting, right? You can't go against natural forces. So you can't ask a team to drop a lease on a host they just have right now and move to AWS just because. But you can create different checkpoints that they follow the natural forces. So as the lease expires, you can say, now move the new hardware. Or as you deprecate a service that its software is old and you create a new service, you can start building it in AWS natively. And I think using those natural forces to your advantage is a great way to move to AWS.
And as part of that movement, I presume you didn't stop doing the things you needed to as a security organization.
Correct.
Data loss prevention, forensic analysis.
Perhaps this is another area which is, for us in the beginning, a little bit challenging because we had to reimagine again how you do forensics in the cloud. You had to reimagine what it is to have ephemeral storage, which is a good thing for many ways. It's also difficult to actually do security forensics on it. So again, making small experiments, trying to figure out, build some customized tools, suggest it to our service providers so that we could get them natively, I think it's been a very good story for us.
And no movement is completely easy, painless.
Yeah.
What did you learn?
This is the painful slide. Basically, when AWS became available, generally available to a lot of our engineers, there's a mentality of a gold rush. Everybody with a credit card went in, got a bunch of EC2 instances, and moved their services there. And although it was exciting, it was too fast, too many, and sometimes quite erroneously moving to AWS. We had giant clusters that people abandoned. We had bad configurations that we had to go fix afterwards. And the funny thing is, although it was painful at the time, I would not trade it for the world because we learned a whole set of lessons. One of the key lessons is when you move to the cloud, don't think that you have to move the same monolithic enterprise that you have directly there. There's better translation layers. There's better ways to take advantage of the cloud compared to what you do there. The other thing that we learned is we always thought Amazon.com is a giant monolithic enterprise. But in reality, what you do have is you have a whole set of small businesses with different goals, different timetables, different levels of risk that they want to move to the cloud. So if you could actually break them apart and move them there, then that's kind of good because you increase speed. And we're trying to figure out, funny enough, we're trying to figure out how we're going to do this. And a song by Vera Lynn played. I don't know if you heard it. It's a very old song. And it talks about tiny bubbles. And we thought the idea of, well, wait, what if we bubbleize our enterprise? And TMing that word right now, by the way. What if we take the enterprise and put all the small businesses in small bubbles? They're completely agnostic of each other, but centrally controlled from some middle area that we put, like, our security suites, our logging analytics, and all the other stuff. We ran this idea, we ran some experiments, and I think this is like a new way. This is how we're thinking about the cloud, and that's how we're moving about it. And by the way, only the other point I want to talk about tiny bubbles. Think of a case where you had enterprises being infected by something and their operations become completely paralyzed. If you had the concept of small bubbles, you could recover your enterprise really quickly as you can take a bubble down and then bring a bunch of them, another one up really quick. The concept of ephemeral utopia. Sorry, I love that word. Yeah.
And that's an area that I want to echo and repeat. The concept of small building blocks is one that works with services, but it also works with security. Small containment zones mean that you have boundaries that you can use to enforce controls that are specific to individual applications, rather than having to have one monolithic set of controls at a border. It also does give you the ability, as George pointed out, to rebuild sections of your enterprise from scratch without affecting the rest of the operation. So even if one portion does get infected with something, does get affected by an attacker, you do have a fighting chance at being able to both prevent that spread of the contagion to something else, but also then to be able to rebuild portions of it in isolation from the rest of the enterprise. So for example, you could easily construct VPCs that are used for recovery from an event that don't have network connectivity into the affected portion of your enterprise, move your user connectivity from their workspaces over to the unaffected or new portions of the network construct, and stand up your applications, get things back running again, without having to take down the rest of the infrastructure. So that's a design theory that I think many people should explore. It may not be right for your business, but it's right for ours. And it's one that I think is something we're going to focus a little bit more on in some of our documentation and best practices as a way to help people understand how to build things better from the beginning. Now, George, as part of this move, obviously you have a very large user base inside the company that you have to deal with. Did you use the same identity federation process that any other customer does right now with us?
I don't know that yet. A lot of the design is still ongoing, clearly, right? But the best thing I can say about, like, the tiny bubble design and the whole thing, for us it was basically a concept that then you have to go translate into your own monolithic enterprise.
Excuse me, I love the weather in Las Vegas.
Yeah.
All right, access control and logging were obviously areas that we wanted to talk about here as well. When you move into this kind of environment, one of the points I believe that you brought up in the discussion about tiny bubbles was ensuring that you were using VPC flow logs as a way to ensure you got visibility into the intercommunication between the individual environments. Did that also give you the ability then to profile your services to understand what they're actually doing and establish baselines for them?
That is correct. Logging is probably one of the final frontiers when you move into the cloud. All of a sudden, you can find yourself completely overwhelmed with the amount of data. You're not looking anymore for needles in the haystack, you're looking for needles in like whole universes. So you have a couple big challenges. The first one is your ability to consume logs in a tremendous rate. And I think this is where originally we built a bunch of our tools, and now we're transitioning to Kinesis and right now Firehose. The second biggest problem with all this data is visibility and trying to figure out the right weight of what is important and what is not important. And I think this is, again, where some of the work that you guys are doing has actually helped us be able to do this. The other thing now that I think is the final tying point to the whole security posture about log analyzing and taking action is how you'd actually remedy the enterprise on the fly. And this is probably the key element in security. You can create the analytics, you can have a human going up and drawing conclusions, but then the remedy is actually extremely expensive instead of times. And when you're talking about massive operations, you really cannot have enough humans to go do this job. So basically, probably our next frontier that we have to kind of work together is security at a huge scale based on analytics.
And I want to drill into one thing that you said there a little bit, and that's around remedies. One of the areas that we talked about is designing and actually executing the concept of exercises in recovering from events. And as part of that, I know that we had talked about you having sets of known good images that you could recover from and actually spinning them up in VPCs. Anything you want to share on that particular front?
Yeah, so there's a couple of cases through this year that we noticed recoverability of certain enterprises could have been extremely hard. And when we looked at our posture, and when you look at every other, a normal posture, you say, how do you find yourself to have the right level of a baseline image to get out there? So we came up with this idea of taking portions of our infrastructure, moving them into a separate VPC, and excuse me for the word, it's not exactly technical, but put a diode in front of it that you actually stop the flow of any information until it's only done with very strict procedures and completely offline. So if everything goes really bad, then you can actually reverse this diode, wipe up your enterprise, and start recovering bubbles from that location.
And that's something I want to make sure we focus on yet again there. It's the concept of a one-way replication pipeline where you move copies of your most important information into a containment zone which does not have generalized access. It means that you've got a place where you know what the durability and the availability story is because it's part of the AWS enterprise, but it's also not generally accessible to your other applications, and it's not generally accessible to your staff. So it's a way to ensure that you've got live replication of that data that's off of the corporate network, that's not on a portion of the network that's accessible to somebody from the outside, and gives you the ability to do what George just said, which is if something really bad happens on the main portion of the infrastructure, to burn down that main infrastructure, rebuild it, and then flow the data back in from the live standby that you've got. And that's critical to the ability of any company to recover from a circumstance where you've not been able to prevent a problem in the first place. And one of the things that I think George touched on, but again I want to emphasize, is you've got to practice that. Correct. It's all wonderful to build that kind of infrastructure, but if you don't exercise it on a regular basis, it's going to atrophy. You know, it's the same theory as when you're designing software. If there are portions of your software that are modal, that don't get used unless something occurs, there's a decent chance they can atrophy too, and that's true in security controls. So we believe very strongly, and we both practice internally game day exercises on a regular basis, and those exercises are often unannounced to our staff, where we'll say, okay, something's occurred in this particular portion of the infrastructure, what do you do? That helps us make sure that we've got the kinds of things like runbooks in place, that runbooks are current, we know what the contact procedures are, everybody has the authentication and authorization credentials that they need, they know where to go for information, how to gain access to log material, they can actually process the logs, which is a non-trivial task in many circumstances. When you look at the kinds of questions we have to be able to ask our infrastructures internally, it tends to be, show me everybody who touched this box over the last X time period and what did they do? Or show me everybody who touched this fleet of systems over the last X time period. Now, luckily for us, many of those fleets have very, very, very few human users, so that's not difficult. But on some fleets where there's a lot of interaction with human staff, that can be quite a pile of data. So one of the things, for example, that we did on our team was we decided to go ahead and use Redshift as an analytics process. So we load in SSH logs into Redshift clusters, and allows us to do all sorts of kind of entertaining queries. The great news is that if we get it wrong, we just burn down the cluster, start over again, and it costs very little to do so. Now, we're talking again about people here and the structure of staff. And I can't get enough emphasis on this. One of the reasons that George's team is successful is because of the way they designed the team itself and the way they built it. It's for short cycle iterations, meaning very short paths between identification of an issue and remedy of an issue. That means the engineering team sits right next to the operations team. It means there's an influence that occurs there on a regular basis. The engineering teams for both of us are the people who build our tools, the people who build our internal processes. The operations people who have to use them every day should have as short a distance as possible between their use of the tool and the guy who built it. Ideally, you'd like to reach your arm out and touch them. That means also that it's not a process of quarterly check-ins to see where you are on a roadmap or things like that. It means that our operations staff often attends the daily stand-ups of our engineering teams, because we want that kind of direct influence in the development process itself. They are customers, and in fact, our operations team is a proxy for our customers, because they perform many of the same tasks in our corporate enterprise that you guys perform in your own.
So if you want to say something about hiring security engineers and thinking about your security staff, if there is one magic power, superpower that your staff should be able to do, is they should be able to slow down time. Allow the attacker to move in real time, and if you can slow time, get inside their decision loop, that's the way you win. And you're talking about the logs, and it just hit me right now. One of the key elements about practicing and practicing again is your ability to recover your logs really quickly.
And recovery of logs. Obviously, Amazon S3 and Glacier give you a really easy way to store your logs, so do CloudWatch logs. The key there is who can delete logs. Ensuring that you've got the right controls in place so somebody who might be dropping something into a log that you'd be interested in don't have the ability to go in and delete the logs. So in our circumstances, for example, one of the things that we do is ensure that we either have read-only rights for the service teams who need to use those logs, or we actually make a duplicate copy of the logs that we provide to the service teams for their general use, where the security team gets their own copy of the log material. And that depends on the individual log set, its relative value, the likelihood of need of access by the service teams, et cetera. The point there is ensure that the people who need to have the access to the material at the worst possible time do so, that they exercise that use of the data regularly, that they know what the log format is and the tools work with that particular log format. So design and deployment theory. This is an area where we spend a lot of time re-emphasizing to people the need for sensible defaults. Sensible defaults are your #1 way to avoid problems in the future. If you give an SDE a way to do something that's easy for them to use, that uses a good set of controls, that gives the security professionals the access they need, they're much more likely to do the kinds of things that you'd like. Inheriting compliance controls, of course, is all about the work that we do on your behalf. George's team doesn't have to do the work on a lot of the PCI controls anymore because we do. They consume the exact same PCI reports that you do as customers. Use of available security features. George touched on a lot of those today, the things that he thinks are very important for operations and security at a very large scale. And of course, we talked about managing templates. Now, an area where we both share a lot of attention is this first bullet. People cause problems when they're in contact with systems. And it's an area that we put a lot of emphasis in reducing. It's an area that we ask customers to think very carefully about. It's an area that many customers have a lot of questions about how they should undertake this. And if you have questions about how to architect your AWS infrastructure to reduce or segment access to people, I encourage you to reach out to a security relevant SA or solutions architect. If you don't have one that you know already, stop by the AWS booth. They can help you talk to one today. And start thinking about what's the best way to design security within your own business set. Reduction in privileged accounts. George, this is an area that you and I have talked quite a bit about.
Yeah, we spend an infinite amount of time looking at permissions groups and actually removing people who do not need it. And it's amazing because if you, as I told you before, if you look at a population of 180,000 people in constant motion, things move all the time. So back to the removing people, having the ability to create controls, having the ability to have analytics that allow you to draw the right conclusions and reduce privilege is paramount.
Reduction in privilege, reduction in access, allowing us to take on some of the heavy lifting can lead to a situation where you can do something that harks back to what George said right in the beginning of the conversation, which is his most precious thing is his staff in terms of resources. And allowing the staff to concentrate on the things that matter means that he gets a much better result.